What if a finance company from Australia convinced a former British Prime Minister to personally lobby the government for it? What if the loans it was making were backed by invoices that did not exist yet? What if $10 billion of client money was tied up in something nobody fully understood? This is Greensill Capital. This is real. He grew up on a sugarcane farm in Queensland, Australia, and he said that watching his family struggle to get paid on time was what drove him to revolutionize global finance, and the story was compelling and the accent was disarming and the vision was bold and the world's most powerful people believed every word of it, and by 2021 Greensill Capital was valued at $7 billion and Lex Greensill was listed among the most influential financiers on earth, and he had a knighthood recommendation pending from the British government, and he had a former British Prime Minister personally lobbying on his behalf, and he had built one of the most impressive financial empires anyone had ever seen, and then in the space of about 2 weeks it was gone and the Prime Minister was disgraced and the knighthood never came, and Lex Greensill was left with nothing but questions he could not answer. Supply chain finance sounds complicated, but the idea is simple and it works like this. Imagine a large company like a supermarket that buys goods from hundreds of smaller suppliers, and the supermarket agrees to pay those suppliers in 90 days, but the suppliers need cash now to pay their own workers and buy their own materials, so a finance company like Greensill steps in and pays the suppliers immediately, taking a small fee, and then waits to collect the full payment from the supermarket in 90 days, and this is called supply chain finance or reverse factoring, and it is entirely legitimate and it serves a genuine purpose, and banks and finance companies have offered versions of it for decades. Lex Greensill did not invent supply chain finance, but he packaged it brilliantly and he sold it to the world as a revolutionary new asset class, and he convinced Credit Suisse to package Greensill's supply chain finance loans into investment funds that Credit Suisse then sold to its clients, and at its peak Credit Suisse had approximately $10 billion of client money invested in Greensill-linked funds, and the pitch was that these were safe short-term assets backed by real invoices from real companies, low risk, steady returns, boring in the best possible way. The problem was that not all the invoices were real, and some of the loans Greensill was making were backed by what Greensill called prospective receivables, which meant invoices that had not yet been issued for transactions that had not yet happened, based on business that might come in the future. And this is a very long way from the safe, boring short-term asset that Credit Suisse had described to its clients, and it meant that Greensill was essentially lending money against the hope that future business would materialize, which is a fundamentally different and far riskier thing than lending against confirmed outstanding invoices. Greensill had also become dangerously concentrated in its exposure to a single client, GFG Alliance, the steel and metals conglomerate run by British industrialist Sanjeev Gupta, and GFG Alliance had borrowed billions from Greensill, far more than any prudent lender should have extended to a single borrower, and this concentration meant that if GFG Alliance ever experienced financial difficulty, Greensill would be in serious trouble simultaneously across a large portion of its portfolio. Greensill had another problem, which was its insurance, and the credit insurance that was supposed to protect the investors in Credit Suisse's Greensill-linked funds against losses on the underlying loans. That insurance was provided by a small number of insurers, and in 2020 those insurers began to have serious concerns about the risks they were underwriting, and in July 2020 the main insurer, Tokio Marine, announced it would not renew its coverage when the policy expired in March 2021, and without insurance the entire structure that Credit Suisse had built around Greensill began to collapse because the funds depended on insurance to be marketable to clients. Credit Suisse began winding down its Greensill-linked funds in February 2021, and this triggered a liquidity crisis for Greensill itself because Greensill depended on Credit Suisse's funds as a primary source of the capital it needed to make new loans, and on March 3, 2021 Greensill Capital filed for administration in Australia, the equivalent of bankruptcy, and the collapse exposed the full scale of what had happened, approximately $5 billion in loans that were connected to the prospective receivables model, billions more concentrated in GFG Alliance, which immediately faced its own financial crisis, and $10 billion of Credit Suisse client money that was now tied up in a highly complex and uncertain recovery process. Then came the political scandal, and this is where Greensill became something more than a financial story, and it became a story about the relationship between money and political power, and at the center of it was a former British Prime Minister, David Cameron, who had become a paid advisor and lobbyist for Greensill after leaving office, and Cameron had lobbied the British government extensively on behalf of Greensill, sending text messages to government ministers, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, pushing for Greensill to be granted access to government-backed coronavirus lending schemes that would have allowed Greensill to make loans backed by British taxpayer guarantees, and Cameron's lobbying was ultimately unsuccessful. The British government did not grant Greensill the access Cameron was seeking, but the conduct was deeply controversial and triggered a major parliamentary inquiry into lobbying ethics and revolving door culture in British politics. The inquiry found that Cameron had fallen short of the standards expected of former prime ministers in using his personal contacts to lobby government ministers through text messages and informal channels rather than through the formal registered lobbying process, and it was a significant personal embarrassment for a former prime minister who had once been one of the most powerful politicians in Europe, and it raised fundamental questions about what access former leaders should have to their successors and what obligations of restraint exist when private financial interests are involved. Lex Greensill himself gave evidence to parliamentary committees and to the press, and he maintained that he had built a legitimate business that had served real customers and that the collapse had been triggered primarily by the withdrawal of insurance rather than by fundamental dishonesty in his business model, and there is an element of truth in this. Supply chain finance itself is legitimate. Some of Greensill's business was entirely conventional, but the extension into perspective, receivables and the dangerous concentration in GFG alliance represented a significant departure from the conservative model Greensill had described to Credit Suisse and to investors, and whether that departure constitutes deliberate deception or reckless overconfidence is a question that investigations and legal proceedings will continue to examine for years. Sanjeev Gupta's GFG alliance survived, barely, through a combination of asset sales and refinancing, and continued to operate though under significant financial pressure and regulatory scrutiny, and GFG's survival meant that the worst catastrophic scenario, thousands of British steel workers losing their jobs, was at least partially avoided, though the financial losses to Credit Suisse clients remained substantial. So what is the real lesson of Greensill Capital? And the lesson is about two things happening simultaneously, and the first is the repackaging of risk. Taking something that was genuinely risky and describing it in language that made it sound safe, prospective receivables described as supply chain finance, concentration risk hidden inside diversified fund language, insurance dependency not adequately disclosed, and the second is about political access, the ease with which someone with money and a compelling story can acquire access to the most powerful political figures in a country and use that access to pursue financial interests in ways that blur the line between legitimate advocacy and corruption, and Greensill did both simultaneously, and the combination was what made the story so striking. Not just a financial collapse, but a financial collapse that reached into Downing Street. That is the Capital case. Subscribe to the Capital case because the next case is already waiting.